Andrew, hello. We've got wonderful Andrew Marr, whom everyone will know from the Marr show, from his history in journalism, including going right back to being editor of The Independent, but also for being BBC's political editor for his many books, for his many associated television shows. He is a favourite of my wife's and a favourite of, sure, lots of people online as well, and a favourite of mine. I was just saying before that I went on his Start the Week show, and his knowledge of what everyone was writing about was just amazing. So, Andrew, thank you very much for coming. I think we agreed that it would be silly to carry on into broader perspectives while missing what's happening right underneath our nose. So let's just start with today in politics. Tell us a little bit about your fix on what's happened today.
Well, forever in Downing Street, the head of communications has been a really important job. And since we've started this webinar, Jack Doyle, Boris Johnson's head of communications, a man Boris Johnson has leaned on heavily, has resigned. And the kind of day it is the kind of day in which that is not very big news, because the even more important person, Munira Mirza, who has been really his policy brain since Boris Johnson's days in the mayoralty of London and then at Downing Street, has not only resigned, but has done so while issuing a blisteringly critical letter about Boris Johnson smearing the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, as being somebody who was soft or sympathetic to the paedophile Jimmy Savile. And she has said that that has been a completely unacceptable and irresponsible thing to do, and that she can't live with it, and she's going. Now, a lot of commentators are already describing this in various different forms as the Ravens leaving the Tower of London, or Burnham Woods heading towards Dunsinane for the end of Macbeth, as a real end of days moment. And certainly that's how it feels. I think the hardest thing, Danny, for all of us at the moment is judging, is calling whether Johnson is going to go or not, whether he's going to be forced out or not. And I have to say, today, January the 3rd, feels like a day when things have moved very badly, very decisively against him.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the key thing was his appearance in the House of Commons, actually. Before that, I was sensing among members, I don't know whether you agree with this, Andrew, among members of Parliament, that they would be probably willing to live with him, providing he wasn't directly implicated. And I think if he's directly implicated in these parties, it's hard to see him surviving, whatever the atmosphere. But I thought that if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't directly implicated, he would probably survive. The performance in the House of Commons, with its aftershocks, has now persuaded me that that may well not happen. How exactly it unfolds, because prime ministers have a lot of power and a lot of weight, we don't know. You had some interest and a very interesting column on this. And first of all, you might just tell us a little bit about your own personal response to what's happened to the Partygate, because that was very interesting. And then you had some reflections on who you thought might be the leading contenders, which weren't the conventional choices. So you might tell us about that.
All right. Well, happy to talk about both. It's very odd journalism because, you know, your mind goes down one track and sometimes you ignore the blindingly obvious. And the whole point of the Partygate saga, obviously, is that the misbehavior in Downing Street resonated with so many people who'd obeyed the rules during the pandemic at home. And that's why it's different, I think, from many other similar sort of crises. And I was at the funeral service in St. Margaret's Church for Jack Dromey, who was married to Harriet Harman, himself a Labour MP, and for a long time a trade union leader, someone I knew, not well, but well enough, and really, really liked. And whatever you thought of his politics, somebody who went into politics for the highest and noblest reasons, to help other people and to do the right thing. And it was an ecumenical kind of service in St. Margaret's Church, a beautiful 12th century church. And there were Roman Catholic elements and Anglican elements and lots of Tories there. Jacob Rees-Mogg was there, many other Tories, as well as the entire Labour hierarchy from Blair, Brown, Keir Starmer and the rest of them. Anyway, during part of the service, I was thinking about the fact that Boris Johnson was going to have to go and defend being ambushed by a cake and the alleged lies and all the rest of it, the House of Commons, just a few hundred yards away in about an hour's time, and thinking of this kind of, it felt like a stain on politics. And I suddenly thought back and I realized for the very first time something I should have realized all along, which was that during the period, the week, when that first party in the Downing Street garden took place, and they were all having a high old time and whooping with laughter and all the rest of it, I was burying my father. And he was an absolutely devoted member of the Church of Scotland. We had a small village church. He had been an elder, which is a kind of senior officiating figure in the church for 56 years, I think. And he'd been the treasurer of the church for 50 years. And the church was locked and barred, and we could not say goodbye to him in his own church. And we were limited to a very small number, I think about 6 or 7 of us, standing around the grave outside in the wind. We had a bagpiper, we had some poems, we did our best. But it was not the send-off which my wonderful father, a really, really great man I revere hugely, it's not the send-off he deserved. And as I reflected on that day and what was going on in Downing Street, I felt terribly sad. And then over the course of the next 10 minutes or so, as the music carried on around me, I felt progressively angrier and angrier and angrier. And I was almost choking with anger as I came out of that church. And I wrote about it. And that was the moment when I thought, I really have had it with Boris Johnson. This is not a normal journalist's reaction to a normal prime minister. This is enough. And I'd sort of passed some kind of emotional line. So anyway, that was me, and I don't mind that matter. I'm just one hack. Who cares? But I felt actually I had experienced something that millions of other British people have felt as well.
Absolutely.
Fast forward. So I think, to put it crudely, sooner or later, I don't know how, I don't know when, he's toast. It's getting Boris Johnson out of number 10 is going to be harder than getting poo out of the honey pot. It's going to be really tricky, and it's going to be quite bloody and aggressive as well. But I think it's going to happen. And I've been looking around, talking to lots of Conservatives about the likely successors. Now, one of the interesting things is normally you just assume that the successor comes from the cabinet. But this cabinet has been chosen by Boris Johnson to be, as it were, clients of Boris Johnson. They're under his shadow and they're under his influence. And they've been looking more and more distressed as they've been trying to defend him in public. And I don't think any longer that the next leader of the Conservative Party, and therefore Prime Minister, need necessarily come from the cabinet. Tom Tugendhat, who's a courageous but rather loner figure on the Liberal wing of the party, very interested in defence, has announced. I think the much more interesting person is Jeremy Hunt, who was beaten by Boris Johnson in the last leadership campaign. He was Health Secretary, he was Foreign Secretary, and did well in both jobs, I think. The Labour Party will go for his record as Health Secretary, but he's almost the opposite of Boris Johnson. He is an equable, endlessly polite, calm, reasonable figure from the centre of the Tory party. Now, the Tory party has, of course, moved to the right, so maybe he's got no chance. But I just wonder if he can persuade the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, to stand alongside him when he announces, they would be unbeatable, probably. Rishi Sunak, why would he not go for it? He's the favourite at the moment, way ahead, and he may well be the answer in the end. But he's quite young. He's very young, and he's not very blooded in a bare-knuckle, rough politics of the kind that's going to be necessary now. And he might conclude that actually his best bet was to ally himself with somebody else, wait a while, and go for it when it would fall into his lap more readily. I don't know if that's the case, but there's a few early thoughts.
Right. Well, that's very, very interesting. I'm pretty much certain that he will go for it. But I, yeah, and I also think, I think you're right. I think Jeremy Hunt is much stronger than people think. That the other people who are strong is obviously Liz Truss. But the other person who's not sort of a main person but has a strong chance is Penny Mordaunt, actually. And
we haven't mentioned Nadeem Zahawi.
Yeah, I do. People have talked about him. I don't think he would be I don't think he will emerge as the answer, because I like him very much, but I don't think he's to be leader is a big job, and I don't think he's actually quite good enough to do that. And I think that would be obvious, but we'll see. It's very interesting to talk about these things. The only bit of your analysis where I don't think is I think the chances of Rishi supporting Jeremy
low.
I think that's quite unlikely. Yeah. I mean, he talked to me about who he should support in the last leadership election. Admittedly, he supported Boris, and that wasn't one of the people he mentioned to me. But he also didn't mention Jeremy Hunt in that list. Anyway, so it's interesting. So we'll see. Let's step back from that. It's very kind of you to be willing to deal with today's events, and I think everyone would have enjoyed that. But let me start with this question. So I opened an email to find that not only have you become columnist on the New Statesman, something that I knew you were going to do, and I thought was very understandable. It's become a very good magazine under Jason Cowley. You've actually decided to become the political editor of the New Statesman. And then I thought, my goodness, has he gone nuts? I can't believe it. You've done, because that's like a huge job, particularly at a moment when Labour's on the up. So tell us your thinking in taking on another big sort of executive role, which involves, all the daily political things, because NHS have got big things online. So talk us through that.
Well, the main thing, I think, is that being political editor means that I have oversight and influence on the New Statesman's political team. And they have, I would think, 4 or 5 really good, very young political reporters cutting their teeth. Their names, Harry Lambert, Alva Ray, and so on. And I've got authority to hire some more people if I want as well. So I'm not going to be doing a lot of the work. I'm going to be shaping and I hope leading and guiding the team. I've got a lot of, but as I said to them, I'm old enough and ugly enough to have no particular ambitions or sharp elbows of my own. I now want to help them to do the best work they can and help the New Statesman to break more stories. And I think I've been around Westminster for long enough that I can do that. And so it's more of a kind of gentle leadership and encouragement role I hope to do there.
Right. So I really enjoyed the New Statesman, and I've become increasingly found it brilliant. And some of Harry Lambert's, for example, articles on Number 10 have been brilliant, actually brilliant. So it's turned into a place where you can read general political news. Does you joining the New Statesman in that role suggest the New Statesman is ever more trying to become less a part of the Labour movement and more a kind of liberal publication to rival, I don't know, New York Magazine or The Atlantic? Or is it you deciding that you kind of like to be quite involved in the politics of Labour? Which of these things does your appointment signify?
So I would say I think it's dangerous for any British publications to look over the pond and model themselves on American ones. Our culture is very different. I know that because I'm also writing at the moment for the New York Times, and the whole editing and oversight is so different. So no, I don't think the New Statesman should be more like the Atlantic or the New Yorker. I do think that, if a modern democracy was to be made happier and more effective by lots of journalists shouting as fans, then we would be a very happy and effective country of a kind that we are not. So I really don't think my job is to be a Labour partisan in that sense. I think our job on the New Statesman is to be analytical, to look at all sides fairly, ask ourselves, so if they do that, what follows? Who's likely to get that job? What's likely to be the result of that policy argument, and so on? To be informed, analytical, critical, and above all, to give readers a sense, if they read the paper, okay, I understand, broadly speaking, what's happening in British politics and the power structures a little bit more clearly than I did half an hour ago. That's the object. And then one final thing, because it's easy to be too clever about this. I started off reading the New Statesman as a schoolboy and then as a student. And I did so because it had brilliant writing. It was the age, there was James Fenton, the poet, was writing there a lot. Martin Amis was writing some of his best essays there, Christopher Hitchens, and so on. And that tradition has continued. But I think the main thing is to get just the best, most stylish, most amusing writing we can find. And that's about all of us searching out the great writers. Most of them, unfortunately, have paid far too much money by the Times already, but we're going to do our best to find some other ones.
um, okay, so I was very excited because I realised I get to be one of the first people to talk to you, and after you've said you're now free to express your own opinions. So I'm now going to give you the right that you correctly didn't give to on people on your program, which is to dodge this question if you don't like it very much, because you very kindly agreed to do this. But it would be interesting to me if you were expressing your politics, and I would say you had Jeremy Corbyn at one end of the spectrum, and then perhaps you would have Ed Miliband and Keir Starmer, which is an interesting question as to which of them would be to the left of the other, then Gordon Brown, then Tony Blair, then you moved on to David Cameron, Theresa May, maybe, where does Boris Johnson fit? But where in that, Margaret Thatcher then, where would in that spectrum would you put yourself?
I'm dodging around the centre of that spectrum, I guess. I'm not very left. I'm not very right. I guess here's my political philosophy, which might be the easiest way of describing it. And it's a very simple one, which is that unlike a lot of people on the left, unlike most of the people on the left, I believe in the market. I believe the market is, in terms of our current civilization, it's the air we breathe, or it's the water we swim in, or choose your metaphor. And the market is why I have this remarkable but extremely annoying object, an iPhone beside me, and it's why we're talking on this technology, and it's why we can move around London so easily, and it's why, in many respects, we're likely to live longer than our great-grandparents and our grandparents, and so on and so on. And yes, the world is overall becoming better off, and that is partly down to the fast inventions and the ingenuity and the imagination brought by a competitive market. But I look back to history, and I think all traditional communities have had a market. They've had a place where people come and barter and change and exchange ideas, but they've also had a church or a mosque or a temple, and they've had a school, and they've had some kind of governing. And I think the market only works when it is, as it were, overseen by politics. I think the market produces two really big problems. One, intolerable inequality left to by itself, and it's the job of politics to, as it were, chasten or rein that in. And secondly, it makes a mess. In our terms, it's global warming, but it's been forms of pollution and environmental destruction throughout modern humanity's time. And the job of politics is to clear up the mess and reduce the inequality, full stop, period.
Well, that's very interesting. Obviously, I'm in the same space, and it's a brilliantly formulated view of the position which we both share. Here's a criticism of obviously there'll be things we disagree on, by the way, but here's a criticism of this position that we're both, this space that we're both in, that it actually just represents the liberal metropolitan elite, and that and it's also an out-of-date view of politics, right? Dominic Cummings says the centre doesn't really exist. Most people are economically left-wing, culturally right-wing. I mean, I'm very crudely expressing it. That is actually whether you call that the centre or not, that is where most people are. And politics is rotating, so that the Labour parties are going to become more liberal. The Conservative Party is going to represent more less diverse areas with less income, seats that used to be Labour. So the position that we affect to call the centre is in fact no longer the centre. How would you respond to that?
Right. Well, I would say that was Dominic Cummings, as it were, produces a very interesting party-based critique, but he doesn't really get down to what I'm saying about the market and the need to, as it were, nurture and celebrate the market by restraining it, which is my fundamental point. And I think that argument applies as much to a former fisherman in Grimsby or a family of care workers in East Glasgow as it does to anyone living in London, though as we both know, London is as varied as anywhere else. In terms of what's going on in the parties, I have a very slightly but allied theory to that, which is a little bit more personal, because it seems to me that what happened during my time as a political writer is that Tony Blair reached deep out of the Labour family, the socialist family, into Middle England, prioritising things like patriotism and the fight against crime and so on. And by doing that, he won 3 stonking general election victories. And the price that was paid is the Labour Party stumbled out of that experience, disorientated, and no longer really knowing who it was. And I think because of Brexit and then the 2019 election, when Boris Johnson won all of those Northern and Midlands English seats, I think the same is happening in reverse to the Tory party, in that Boris Johnson has reached into Labour England in particular and acquired lots and lots and lots of voters who really want much higher public spending and a bigger state in many ways, as well as, of course, as you say, culturally conservative viewpoints in different ways as well. And so I think Boris Johnson, if he's allowed to carry on for much longer, is doing to the Tory party long term what Tony Blair did to the Labour Party before its collapse into Corbynism. And so I suppose it's a different way of slicing the same Cummings argument, but I don't disagree with that. I think people do want economic security increasingly hard in a globalized world, and there is a powerful nostalgic sense of wanting to preserve their communities and their sense of themselves.
Okay, so just to let everyone know, in about sort of 10 minutes or so, I'm going to go to Q&A. We will then have about a quarter of an hour for Q&A, and then at 7:15 hard, Andrew has to go. I just want you to put those into the Q&A, not into the chat, but into the Q&A if you've got them. Okay, so do you think that the argument about Europe is settled for a generation? Or do you think that more rapidly than is conventional wisdom, we're going to end up having a debate about rejoining the European Union?
So I don't think we're going to have a debate in the next 10 years, a serious one about rejoining, for 2 reasons. One, I think so many people across the spectrum here realize how toxic it was first time round and don't want to revisit that. And 2, I think Europe is changing as well. And I think it's becoming, in many respects, a tougher place for us to join. I can remember vividly making a film about Angela Merkel well before the Brexit vote, about 3 years before the Brexit vote, but when Brexit was being talked about, not that word, but Britain leaving. And Angela Merkel's, as it were, Alistair Campbell figure, I can't remember his name now at the time, but a very, very bright, inevitably spoke better English than I did, took me to one side in the Chancellery and put an arm on my shoulder and said, look, Andrew, you must not do this. And I said, what do you mean you must not do this? What? He said, you British, you must not leave the EU. And I said, well, thanks for the advice, but why not? He said, you cannot leave us with the French. And actually what's happened is that French leadership of the EU has grown and grown and grown. I mean, Macron is, in terms of the traditional EU balance of power, a pretty titanic figure. And I think it's going to be a much more French-dominated EU running forward, and that is inevitably harder for us to rejoin. I do think that we are going to go back to some form of Theresa May's proposed deal with the EU. In other words, some form of convergence. I don't think most British people care very much about the origin of regulations or convergence. And I think that the trade frictions are going to be greater and greater and greater. And as COVID recedes, they'll become more and more obvious. And if I was the opposition, I would be starting to soften up the ground for a big, generous new trade deal with the EU. Now, that's got problems of its own, but I think that's much more likely than actually rejoining.
He isn't going to do that, though, Keir Starmer, is he?
No, he's not.
Because and it's an interesting question. Do you think his kind of no sudden moves strategy, in which, to use a football analogy, a bit like some of Arsene Wenger's team tried to pass the ball into the net, that is a little bit what Keir Starmer was trying to do. Do you think that's the right thing to do, given that chaos in the Conservative Party? There could be an argument for it.
Well, lots of people have been mocking him or critical of him for an allegedly rather wooden, semi-paralyzed form of leadership. And it has so far worked extremely well. Labour has ticked up and up in the polls, even before the current crisis. And, if there was ever a case for let's have a slightly duller leader who is morally pretty certain of himself, looks at the detail, works hard, and is courteous to colleagues, this may be the moment in British politics when we're ready for such a person. I think Keir Starmer is more interesting than he lets on, and I think his backstory is much better than he lets on. And yet he's pursuing this very, in a sense, politically minimalist strategy. I think the big problem is going to be Scotland in the medium term for the Labour Party. It's very hard to see how Labour wins an overall majority, even with polls like this, without Scotland. And yet it's hard to see what they can do to advance in Scotland. They've got a great leader in Scotland in Anna Sarwar, and it's doing them absolutely no good at all.
Let me ask you about the BBC. You spent a long time at the BBC, but obviously, you weren't, your journalistic career was born elsewhere. You were a very successful journalist before then. So you're not entirely dependent on, you've never been entirely dependent on the BBC for your profile or income or standard or status. So you're sort of free now to speak about that too. When Jeremy Paxman left the BBC, or John Humphreys, it turned out they shared a little bit of the Daily Mail's view of the BBC,
yes.
A tiny bit. I was a bit surprised by that, but they did. So you can now share your view with us of the BBC.
Well, I don't share that view, as it were. What I do think is that, I was 21 years in total, either as political editor or as running the Andrew Marr show. It's a long time. And the problem is, because of the political assaults, initially almost all from the right, but then through the Brexit experience, increasingly from the left and from the centre, the amount of incoming fire is ear-splitting, deafening, and demoralising. And I think all of us had become slightly shell-shocked and twitchy and a bit. I think in retrospect, in the last few years that I spent at the BBC, I was very mildly depressed. And I think it was because of the nuanced, gentle, but persistent self-censorship going on. And it moves into private life as well. So I would find myself at a dinner party or in the pub, really not giving my full view of something because I remembered I'm BBC and I'm not allowed to anymore. And after a while, I completely understand why it happens. And I completely agree with what Tim Davies is doing on impartiality. And it's really, really important. But if you're actually living and working it as a relatively engaged political journalist, and unengaged political journalists are no use, so you have to be, then it becomes pretty exhausting and demoralizing. So I am a supporter of the BBC who personally couldn't do it any longer.
Yeah. So do you think, though, that that is actually a broader problem, and that really the pretense that anybody can really not have any opinions while still talking about politics is really not, it's not tenable. And it would be better. It would be better to have a kind of, Marr and Dale show or whatever it is that involved other people who do express. And maybe LBC, which has now got these kind of, you don't have to have someone as annoying as James O'Brien in order to do this, but maybe LBC has got the kind of, they've got this right. You have Owen Jones and Nigel Farage on the same station, and that's how you achieve impartiality. Well, do you think that might be a better idea?
Now that I'm an LBC boy, of course, I ought to say absolutely I agree with that. And I'm really, really enjoying the fact that nobody is telling me what I should be saying at LBC. That's fantastic. But I think there is a danger of all of us falling into silos, so that one part of the country, one part of the nation listens to Nick Ferrari, as it were, an entirely different part of the nation listens to James O'Brien, and James O'Brien and Nick Ferrari, as it were, don't talk together. So I think it's very important that there's a place where people of different views can come together with a relatively impartial host in a kind of, broadcast or digital public square way. And I think in a way, the job of the BBC should not be to shut down or push to one side strong views or strong opinions, but to allow them to be presented in a fair way and challenged in a fair way. So it's a subtle difference, but I think we would have been better at the BBC in news and current affairs to have had a broader range of views and been a bit more relaxed about it, always with that sort of impartial center gravity, though.
Yes. I guess that's right. Now, let me just deal with the other thing which has been hanging over the BBC, which is the question of the license fee. And we can both agree that for the Culture Secretary to announce this at 7:56 in the morning in a tweet without actually having consulted the cabinet, that was a pretty extraordinary thing to do. But let's leave that, if we can, to one side. You can't entirely, but let's try and leave it to one side and just consider whether or not the argument we've reached the end of the road really with the license fee is right.
Well, I think in the end, probably the best way of paying for the BBC is some kind of universal payment. In other words, if you go for a subscription service, first of all, going for an advertising-based BBC is not going to work because it's going to annihilate the current commercial television companies. It'll have a devastating effect on the whole TV ecology of the UK. If you then say, well, let's have a subscription service like Netflix, that is perfectly plausible. You can see there's lots of things on iPlayer that people would pay for, and you could probably persuade quite a lot of people to pay more than they're paying in license fee at the moment to get that service, Radio 3 and all the rest of it. However, as long as the BBC is only funded by one sort of particular segment of the country, it no longer has to appeal to the whole country or try to appeal to the whole country. So, for instance, if poorer Britons, if people on lower incomes weren't going to join the subscription service and well-off people were, you'd get a BBC tilted towards the better off, etc. So I personally think it needs to be everybody pays for it. The license fee itself, connected to old Bakelite television sets, which are mostly gathering dust in attics these days, is technically completely out of date. And I think probably we should be heading towards some kind of household tax, something or household impost, possibly connected to electricity bills or something like that. But that too, of course, is expensive and controversial.
And would that cover more than just news and current affairs? Because the argument for news and current affairs seems to be very strong. The argument for providing, I'm just watching this, it is brilliant. The drama about Stephen Port, which I recommend to everyone. It's an unbelievable story of police incompetence. It's incredible. But but it's a brilliant drama. But I guess someone would have made that commercially. ITV did the Levi Belling,
Oh, it's, we're seeing absolutely fabulous dramas pouring out of Netflix, Disney Plus, and the Apple and the other streaming services. The idea that only the BBC can make good drama is nonsense. However, they're almost all American, and there is a sort of cultural stroke political bias or kink very often in drama that's not made in Britain by British-owned, British-run companies. And as a patriotic Brit, I want to see really good homemade British television, film and drama. And traditionally, the BBC has been the kind of training ground, the seedbed for an awful lot of that, as well as actually making it. In other words, take the BBC out, and a lot of the really, really good, vibrant, independent TV companies that are making a splash with their new thinking would go or would never have happened in the first place as well. So I go back to is this such a huge problem that it's worth taking all of those risks and pulling down the Jenga tower at this point? And I don't think it is.
Let me change subject completely, because it's one of the things that I think you'll probably encounter in as you have joined the Statesman. I wanted to know about two sort of hot button things and what your perspective is. The first is, do you think there is such a thing as cancel culture, and are you worried about it?
There clearly is such a thing. If you look at the number of academics who've run into trouble recently, I was always suspicious of this term woke or politically correct, because a lot of what is alleged to be woke and politically correct and a threat to Western civilization is in fact not much more than politeness and decency. And if you want, I think using the words that people want to be used to describe themselves is by and large a good thing. We live in a very, very mingled, mixed culture now. culture, in terms of religion, in terms of, well, that's a non-scientific term, and I don't like it, in terms of race, and in terms of gender and sexuality. We are a very, very hybrid, mingled kind of society. And those societies require higher levels, I think, of public politeness and mutual respect. And I think a lot of the so-called woke generation are only really asking for that. But it can only happen in an atmosphere of tolerance. And you see people who have been so-called gender critical, women, feminists, being treated utterly outrageously by kind of either actual or cyber bullying groups. And I think, again, it's about respect, it's about decency. So let's,
It is, but let me put it, let me challenge back the other way. So they would say, well, we're not being shown respect because the various people insist that I, who regard myself as a woman, is not a woman. And so if people should be, if a respect requires people to be called by their, how they would like to call themselves, by and large, a rule that your formulation is exactly mine, but it comes up against this. How does one deal with a competing question of respect, which is the trans row issue, are these competing respects, which is somebody saying you have to show respect to my opinion that your position isn't worthy of respect?
Well, it's a very good question indeed, Danny. But I think the only way I can think about it is how deeply, as it were, do my words, my opinions dig into your real personality and identity. And so a lot of so-called TERF women would say we are only talking common sense, and we are retaining very, very old-fashioned concepts that are part of our culture and part of my identity, like, for instance, breastfeeding, like the use of the word woman to describe a biological adult female. These are things that we will not give up, because it's not that we're being offensive, it's not that we're trying to cross a link or attack anybody else, but they are very much part of the way we see ourselves in the world and part of our deep identity. And there is no answer to this. There are people who take radically different views about those matters. And I think the only thing that a sort of mature, grown-up society can do is to allow those differences to be expressed with mutual respect on both sides. And for trans campaigners who say, but we're not being shown respect, I would very often say, show me the hate words, show me the hate phrase, show me the thing that this person said that really genuinely makes you feel threatened, or in some cases suicidal. Demonstrate it to me and I'll listen.
Okay, well, let me just bring in Ronnie Harris's question. I'll put a question in the Q&A, and again, I'll say that if anyone else wants to put it in the Q&A now, is your big moment. It seems, Andrew, says Ronnie, that you are busier than ever, but at least you can get a rest on a Sunday morning. You might just tell us about that. May I ask if you foresee the breakup of the union with both Scotland and Northern Ireland leaving within the next 10 years? So why don't you just quickly tell us about your Sunday mornings now and getting them back, and then talk about the issue that Ronnie's asking about.
Well, my Sunday morning, as you'd expect, I read the papers with a coffee to one side, amble downstairs, look at the beginning of the Sophie Rayworth show, watch a bit of that, watch most of that, and flick on the North Sky and the rest of it. In other words, I still absorb as much journalism as possible first thing in the morning. But then as a family, we go out and have a Sunday roast, and we're working our way around the local pubs and restaurants to see who's doing the best one. And that's something we haven't been able to do for a long time, and all of us enjoying very much. On Scotland and Ireland, very briefly, 10 years, I don't know. I think that if you look at the demography of the people determined for Scottish independence, it's going to come at some point before too long. And it's going to be a glorious moment in Scotland for journalists, politicians, lawyers, and I'm really, really worried about what the effect would be for working class Scots on pensions. In particular, if Scotland is determined to join the EU while England is outside, there will be a hard border. We don't know what the Scottish currency would be. The money from the oil and the gas has gone. And so I think economically, it's a very, very hard sell. And I hope that is the center. piece of any campaign coming. I hope both sides engage in that properly. And again, in Northern Ireland, people there tell me that Sinn Féin is on course to win the elections, or may well win the elections, and that a border poll, so-called, will follow before too long. I have to say, talking to people in Dublin, I go to there a bit, they tell me that they can envisage a border poll in which the Northern Ireland votes to leave the UK and the south of Ireland does not vote for unification, which would be a mess, but good for journalism.
Okay, just one last thing, and then we have to got to go because, as I say, we promised each other that we would finish hard on 7:15. And it's a different subject again, but another one of these big long-term issues, and that is China. I wondered where you were on the question of whether we lean towards or away from China. If we aren't going to be in the single market, and we're going to be global players, and there's a waning of the United States, don't we have to engage with China? At the same time, if we do engage with China, aren't we then undermining the civil liberties of their own citizens and to some extent threatening our own? Where are you on that?
I don't much like the thought of embracing warmly a sort of Siberian tiger with a glint in its eye. I think the Chinese state is genuinely pretty menacing. It's totally away from our traditions. Chinese civilization, one of the glories of the planet, absolutely. But under Xi, this is a very, very old-fashioned, authoritarian, controlled regime without our freedoms and without our expectations. And if you embrace China properly, then some of that will come here, one way or another. It's already started on the edges of university campuses. You can't, I think, fully engage with China without fully engaging with the Chinese Communist Party. And that is not something that I would urge upon anybody. I think let's look closer to our natural friends and allies, which do include France, Denmark, Norway, etc., and treat America delicately. I mean, they're always going to be important, but you're quite right. They don't look like a stick to lean on very heavily just at the moment.
You don't. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to answer such a wide variety of questions. We darted around a bit, but I wanted to get some breadth to the discussion. Well, I'm sure that the professional interviewer
all the time, so it's been great talk.
Good, well, that's fun. I'm sure that the professional interviewer in you despaired of my darting around in that way. But now I'm going to hand back to David just to say quickly thank you to Andrew, and then he can get off.
Okay. Before I say thank you to Andrew, I've got 2 yes/no answers, as you would do on the Andrew Marr show. Is Putin going to invade Ukraine?
No.
Is Donald Trump going to make a comeback?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, not great, but thank you for those. And thank you for a wonderful conversation that, was at many, many levels. And one of the, I didn't expect it to go to the depth that you did on the gender issue. And that was thank you, Danny, for taking it there, because it's a very important conversation. And I think everyone will have been taken a lot of thought from that one. But just with respect to the word women, we have a women's group that we're just starting. It's called Itemba. Itemba means hope in Xhosa. And you met Gibello earlier, and Gibello is going to be leading this group from South Africa but with supporters from the UK. And we're launching on International Women's Day, which is March the 8th. So I would ask anyone listening and watching this who's interested in joining the Itemba group, please contact Abby at 1-to-1 or me, and we'll get you into the group, and you'll be able to support Gibello in a meaningful way, shoulder to shoulder with the mothers in the Eastern Cape who are delivering healthcare. And that's what it's all about. It's supporting each other. So on that note, Andy, Danny, thank you for a wonderful hour. and look forward to reconvening again, maybe in a year's time.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's been fun. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good